Hey everyone, welcome to the investor.bet AFL Round 4 Betting Trends Preview. In this video, I'm going to go through all the games coming up for Round 4, what I'm considering betting in these games, the reasons why. We're going to go through the betting trends and history between the matchups, what the odds were last times these sides played each other, who's been winning, who's been covering, have their games been going over or under the total points line, all that stuff. So then when you're approaching and betting on the games, you have a lot of information about this one foundational piece, which you can then match up with statistics and other situational factors that I talk about in other videos. Before we look at this weekend's games, I just want to quickly go back to round number 3, which was a really successful weekend for us from a betting perspective. We went 7-2 across all our AFL bets, 7-1 on main bets. So a really good weekend, a strong start to the season through the first 3 weeks plus the opening round. Of the games last weekend, 5 of the 8 went under the total points lines. Only 3 went over, 5 went under. Away teams covered the spread in 5 of the 8 games. Favourites won 7 of the 8 games. The only underdog to win was Essendon when they beat Port Adelaide on the Thursday night. Favourites covered the spread in 5 of the 8 games. And Geelong and North Melbourne, so Geelong against the Brisbane Lions just covered, and then North Melbourne also just covered the spread as big underdogs against Adelaide. They were the only 2 teams to cover but not win the game outright. We'll quickly run through and look at each of these games. As I mentioned, Essendon were the only underdog to win outright. This was a matchup that was filled with inaccuracy from both sides. Essendon got the jump early. Port Adelaide controlled the middle of the game, but Essendon responded in the fourth quarter to kick 4 goals to 1 in the final term to run out winners. So interesting start to the round there. Port Adelaide dropping that game as pretty big favourites considering. Then the Carlton Western Bulldogs game was fairly close for the most part. Carlton were able to generate a fairly sizable lead throughout the first half, but during the second half, Western Bulldogs fought their way back in front, kicking 8 goals to 4 in the second half. So another game where Carlton led at halftime, but went on to lose. So they're in desperate need of a win going into their game this weekend against Collingwood. Melbourne versus Gold Coast. This game was fairly close early on, and then Gold Coast kicked right away in the second half. During the second half, Gold Coast kicked a total of 13 goals to 6 from Melbourne. Early on in the game was pretty low scoring, 38-21 at halftime, and just the 2 goals throughout the entire second quarter. So the fact there was still 182 points scored in this game shows that points can definitely be scored quickly from the Gold Coast Suns. But really good performance. Gold Coast 2-0 now to start the season through their first 2 games. And both of those have been on the road as well. St Kilda ran out huge winners against Richmond, really kicking away late in the game with this matchup. You see it was very close right up till halftime, with St Kilda just leading by 8 points at the halftime break, but they scored 14 goals to 2 in the second half to run out big winners by 82 points. Hawthorn versus GWS. This was an interesting game due to the wind. GWS were kicking with the wind in the first quarter. They scored 37 points to Hawthorn's 2. Then when Hawthorn got the wind in the second quarter, they scored 6 goals to none for GWS. Now going to that other end. So all 11 goals in the first half were kicked to the left of screen. And Hawthorn went into the break leading by 7 points, having 16 scoring shots to 14. Hawthorn were also a little bit inaccurate during that first half. They ended the game with 10 goals, 16. And then in the second half, most of the scoring was then done down the opposite end of the screen, with 6 of the 8 goals in the second half being scored to the right of screen, and Hawthorn ended up winning this game by 12 points. They had 26 scoring shots to 19 from GWS. Could have potentially won that game by a slightly bigger margin, but were able to overcome a bit of a slow start to now go 4-0 on the season. The Brisbane Lions came back to beat Geelong, who got a bit of a margin on them at halftime. It was 48 points to 22. Geelong went into the break with a 26-point lead, but in the second half, Brisbane kicked 7 goals to the Cats 2 to run out 9-point winners in a low-scoring game that was played in tough conditions. Brisbane now still undefeated overall in the season, but all 3 games they've failed to cover the spread, and all 3 games have gone under the total points line. On Sunday, the most obvious game that was going to go over the total on the round, Adelaide scored 114, North Melbourne 78 points. Adelaide led for the entire contest, other than a couple of early behinds from North Melbourne, and the game never really looked in doubt. They pushed the margin out a bit in the second half. They only led by 18 at halftime, but doubled that into the second half, so won both halves by 18 points. Adelaide, real hot start to the season, especially from a scoring perspective, but still no major knocks on North Melbourne. They've been a lot better this season. And then West Coast versus Fremantle, running out big winners, 31 scoring shots to 18. Even game early on. West Coast held a bit of a margin through the first quarter, but late in that first quarter, Fremantle kicked 3 quick goals, and then from that point the floodgates opened. Fremantle could have won by a bigger margin had they been a bit more accurate in front of goal, but pretty dominant win overall in the end. 38-point margin, covering the spread to end the round as another win by the favourite. So that's what round number 3 looked at. Now looking ahead to round number 4, I'm going to go through the betting trends and the betting history between these two matchups. This is a really important factor that isn't readily available. What I try to do with this channel is provide you information that you can't just go onto the AFL website and look at. Now, first of all, like when you go on here, you're only looking at basic statistics, and this only provides you a small part of the picture. You can see the past 3 matchups, what the final scores were, and that kind of information. And if you go to the team stats, it just gives you some generic stats, the typical overarching main statistics. But in the bet finders, we look at the betting history, so more in-depth about what those previous matchups were, and also with the statistics a lot deeper from an attack and defense standpoints, where their points come from, all that information. If you're interested in using more tools to level up your AFL betting and make more money, definitely check out the AFL Best Bets membership. That's where I give you access to every research tool I built for the AFL. Plus, you get to see everything I'm personally betting on the AFL, and also additional previews of why I'm making those specific bets. Looking at the first game, Thursday night, Collingwood versus Carlton. Collingwood favourites here off the bye, minus 12.5. Total 167.5. That total's moved up 1 point during the week to 168.5, even though 5 of the past 6 between these two sides have gone under the total points line. Collingwood have won the past 2 meetings, and they've also won 5 of the past 6, so pretty good record overall in this matchup. Carlton obviously still chasing their first win of the season, and also with Carlton, they're yet to cover the spread so far this season. They've started underdog in their last 2 games, but yet to cover. All 3 of their games have gone under, and for Collingwood, 2 of their 3 games have gone under the total points line so far. So quite a few trends here for the under, so a little bit surprising we've seen the number increase, but I'd be leaning towards the under as it currently stands. Last time they met, the line was 170.5 and it went under that number with 165 points being scored, so only just went under. See, right there you can already see a little bit of an adjustment from the bookmakers to lower that number, and you can see also it went from 172.5 in their early meeting, which went under, down to 170, and now they've moved it down to 167 or 168.5. Collingwood have covered 3 of the past 4 versus Carlton. One interesting thing, the past 16 games, so the past 16 times these two sides have met, the final margin has been between 1 and 29 points. This matchup is rarely a blowout. Carlton have made a habit this season of playing well in the first half, but letting teams run over the top of them, so I think it's going to be close. I think the current handicap at the 12.5 looks about right. Collingwood definitely deserving to be favourites. You could look at Carlton in the first half to be very close, and then Collingwood to kick away a little bit in the second half and win by that 2 to 3 goal kind of margin. Geelong versus Melbourne. Geelong, pretty big favourites, minus 27.5, out to now 28.5, and the total stayed at 173.5. This matchup, the past 2 have gone under the total, and 5 of the past 8 head-to-head have gone under the total points line. Melbourne have covered 4 of the past 6 versus Geelong. The last time they met, Melbourne ran out 8-point winners. That was at the MCG. But this game being played at GMHBA Stadium, if we go back to the last time they met there, Geelong won by 15 points. Also in 2022, Geelong won that game by 28 points, and Geelong covered the spread in both of those, but there wasn't a great deal between them in the market. You can see Geelong started at $1.83 and $1.95 in those 2 games. So Melbourne have been keeping it close, but Geelong have won 2 of the past 3. If you go back to 2021, Melbourne did beat Geelong at home by 4 points. I think Geelong deserving to be big favourites for this game, the way Melbourne has played so far this season. Definitely, there's major concerns. They're coming off a big loss against Gold Coast last week. Also with Melbourne, they're now 3-0 in the season, and scoring's definitely been a problem. They haven't scored over 74 points so far this season and have conceded 120 plus in their past 2 games. At home, Geelong really shouldn't have any issue scoring. Last week it was a low scoring game due to the conditions. They showed in their only game at GMHBA so far this season, they put up 147 points against Fremantle, who did win against West Coast last week but did drop another game prior to that against the Sydney Swans. I think Geelong should win this game and should win it fairly comfortably. I don't really have a huge opinion on the total. At 173.5, I think that what that's telling us is that Geelong could really run up a score here. Melbourne don't have that many points in them. To be honest, I'd probably be looking at Melbourne's team total to go under. The fact we have such a high total, we should be able to get a pretty good number on Melbourne here. And Geelong defensively, their only time they gave up a bigger score than 70 points so far this season was against St Kilda, where St Kilda really got a run on against them, and St Kilda followed that performance up of 98 with 135 points against Richmond. So St Kilda's definitely been showing they can score. So I'm definitely interested in Melbourne's team total to go under in this game. That's probably my strongest lean at this stage. Gold Coast versus Adelaide, both teams undefeated. Both teams technically flying so far this season. Firstly, with the Gold Coast Suns, they go into this matchup favourite, $1.75, minus 4.5 on the handicap. We'll just see if there's been any adjustment in the market. The total from that 176 has moved up to 180.5, but both sides in very good form, so I can understand the reason for that move. Gold Coast has scored 136 and 120 points in both their games so far, and the Crows have had 135, 161, and 114 throughout their 3 games so far. Assuming we get good conditions on the Gold Coast right now, which if you look behind me, it's very wet right now on Wednesday morning. If that weather has cleared up by game time, I think we'll see a bit of a shootout between these two sides. You have the trend of 5 of the past 8 between these two sides going over the total. Gold Coast do have a good record. They've won 3 of the past 4, but Adelaide have covered the past 2. Last time they met was at the Gold Coast in round 1 last season. Gold Coast, similar favourites to what they are here, and they won that game by 6 points. Adelaide only covered it by half a point, and it was a very low-scoring game. But the way they're playing this season, you'd expect this game to be very high scoring. This is Gold Coast season opener. They'll be looking to keep their undefeated run going. One thing to keep in mind with the Crows, they haven't really played any good opposition, and I guess you could say the same thing for Gold Coast. Adelaide have only played St Kilda, Essendon, and North Melbourne, all sides that missed the top 8 last season. For the Gold Coast Suns, they're kind of in a similar boat, playing 16th and 14th on the ladder from last season with West Coast and Melbourne. This is kind of the measuring stick for both of these sides to really see where they're at. So I think it's going to be a very, very good game. Wouldn't surprise me if it was close and high scoring. Richmond versus Brisbane. Brisbane, huge favourites here, minus 45.5, and the total at 177.5. This game being played down in Melbourne at the MCG. Brisbane expected to win comfortably. Richmond have conceded 135 plus in each of their past 2 games. Brisbane haven't been at their best from an attacking perspective. They scored 86 against the Swans, but only 94 at home against West Coast, and then 70 last week against Geelong. I think this could be a game where Brisbane can really get rolling from an attacking perspective. We may be getting like a little bit better of a line for Brisbane here, considering they haven't covered a spread so far and all their games have gone under. For this matchup, the past 7 head-to-head have gone over. Brisbane have won and covered 5 of the past 7, and they've won their last 2 against Richmond by 81 points. You can see here, 163 in their last meeting and 134 in the game prior, but both of those at the Gabba. Last time they met at the MCG, you got to go back to 2022. And Richmond won that game by 7 points as a 2.5 point favourite. But Brisbane will win this game. They should definitely win it by 40 plus if they're serious and don't take their foot off the gas. They have the Western Bulldogs next week on the road as well, so it's not like a huge look-ahead spot for them. They'll do enough to get over the line, but I think it's a little bit risky. If there's good conditions, I think Brisbane can definitely run up a score here and win this game comfortably. North Melbourne versus the Sydney Swans. Important game this for both teams. They're both at 1-2 on the season. Sydney are coming off the bye, and the winner will go to 2-2, and the loser will go to 1-3 on the season. Pretty important game. North Melbourne at home here at Marvel Stadium, but the Swans are favourites -12.5. Last time they met, the Swans were -50.5 at home, but going back to the previous season at Marvel Stadium, Sydney were -35.5 the last time they played here. The bookmakers are telling us the gap between these two teams has closed, which, with the way North Melbourne has played, you definitely have to agree with. Sydney have won the past 8, so have a very, very good record, but North Melbourne have covered 4 of the past 5. But keep in mind, most of those were with big handicaps, so 40.5, 49.5, 35.5. There's definitely, you can say for sure, there's been a lot of improvement with North Melbourne this season, but Sydney coming off the bye, they are the most likely winner of this game, but wouldn't be surprised at all if North Melbourne stole this. I think they'll be well and truly up for this game. They have enough points in them to challenge Sydney. They've scored 97, 125, and 78 in their games so far. The 2 times they've played at Marvel this season, they scored 97 against the Bulldogs and 125 against Melbourne. And against Adelaide last week, lost the game, but still scored 78 points. So I think North Melbourne could be in that 80 to 90 point range here, which will definitely make this game competitive. And you also have the past 5 head-to-head going over, so we could see a little bit of a shootout. GWS versus the West Coast Eagles. GWS huge favourites here, $1.04, -51.5. This is the first game on Sunday afternoon. And the line has already moved up to -56.5, and the total has moved from that 174 up to 178.5. 3 of the past 4 head-to-head have gone over. GWS have won 3 of the past 4 versus West Coast and covered 4 of the past 5. Last time they met was over in Perth in round 2 last season. GWS winning 108 points to 43, so they covered a 48.5 point spread. At home, it's technically not too much of a bigger line in comparison, and it's not like, you know, West Coast have hugely impressed or anything this season. They've struggled to score. They've lost all 3 games, conceded 106 last week against Fremantle, which, as we spoke about, Fremantle could have scored more had they been more accurate. And I think GWS will be very keen to bounce back after the loss against Hawthorn last weekend after leading that game early on. They'll definitely be winning this game. It's just a question how much they win by. I think the line at -51.5 is about right. I expect GWS to be winning in that 40 to 60 point range unless they really put the foot down. We'll just have a quick look at who GWS is playing next week. They face Kilda next week on the road. So a bit of a challenging game coming up after this, and then followed by Adelaide and the Western Bulldogs. So what GWS could, the 2 ways they could approach this is either will really get a bit of a percentage boost here against West Coast, who might be a little bit flat after losing the Western Derby last weekend, or they could have a bit of an eye on St Kilda next week and just do enough to win the game. So that's the way you either want to play the line. Definitely be looking at disposal markets on GWS, that's for sure, in this matchup. Port Adelaide versus St Kilda. Port -12.5 points, looking to bounce back off their loss last weekend against St Kilda, who've won their past 2 against Geelong and Richmond. Port -12.5 out to 13.5, and the total has stayed at 167.5. 8 of the past 10 games between Port Adelaide and St Kilda have gone under the total, including the past 2, and we're getting a higher line this time around at 167.5. We've also seen a history of these matchups being close. The past 5 have been decided by 13 points or less. 2-point margin to Port Adelaide, 10-point margin to Port Adelaide, 7 points, 1 point, 13 points. They're the past 5. At the Adelaide Oval, last time they met, Port were 25.5 point favourites, so about half the handicap this time around. St Kilda playing very well. Wouldn't surprise me at all if they were able to grab a win here on the road against Port Adelaide. I think they're a pretty good chance as an underdog here. Just need to make the trip over, like against a side who has won the past 6 against them. It's definitely a challenge, but Port have been vulnerable. Their only good game, I guess you can call it, so far this season was against Richmond, which isn't anything to write home about. And then they have Hawthorn coming up following this. So there's a bit of a rivalry game between those two sides. So I think Port are vulnerable here at home. And yeah, wouldn't be surprised if St Kilda were able to grab a win or at least keep this game very close. I'll be looking at St Kilda with the plus 12.5 or 13.5, which it is now, or a try bet on either side to win by a small margin, especially when you consider the away team has also covered 10 of the past 11. St Kilda have plenty of points in them. Port, aside from the game against Richmond, have proven that they don't really have that many points in them, and a good defensive side can limit them. St Kilda's defense has been improving. They conceded 135 against Adelaide on the road in week 1 at this venue, but since then have definitely improved in the games against Geelong and Richmond. So on the right track, improving are the Saints. And then final game of the round, Fremantle versus the Western Bulldogs. Fremantle favourites here, minus 7.5, and the total at 168.5. The line has stayed the same, but the total's dropped 2 points to 166.5, even though the past 4 have gone over and 7 of the past 9 head-to-head have gone over. With Fremantle, they're coming off their win against the West Coast Eagles last week, which was their first win of the season. That was the first time they actually looked like a team who could score points against Geelong and Sydney. Their attack was pretty much non-existent. However, they're also top sides from last season. Western Bulldogs are another one of those good defensive sides. To be honest, I am a little bit surprised. This matchup has a history of being high scoring. Both these sides are good defensive teams, but when they play each other, it's clearly not been the case. Both sides scored 80 plus in their last meeting, which was at Marvel. At Optus Stadium, Fremantle scored 95 last game against the Bulldogs, which was early on last season at a similar time. This will be Fremantle's third consecutive home game or game at Optus Stadium. Their game last week was technically an away game, but haven't had to leave Perth for the past 3 weeks. This is a game where if they can grab it, get to 2-2, then go on the road to play Richmond next week, followed by Melbourne, could turn their season around. So I think they'll be well and truly motivated for this matchup. Western Bulldogs still a bit undermanned. I think Fremantle is deserving to be favourite, but I also think they're a little bit difficult to trust. I think this game likely comes down to the wire a little bit, but Fremantle deserving to be favourites. And at this stage, I'm not keen to make too much of a call on the total because the history between the matchup tells me over, but the way these sides play tells me under. So don't have a huge opinion on the total points line. That's currently how I'm looking at approaching the games coming up this weekend. Hopefully this video gave you some insights, particularly into the betting history between these two sides. If you want more information like this and more in-depth previews, definitely check out the AFL Best Bets membership, which I'll put the link to in the description so you can take your AFL betting to the next level and profit this season. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.